The emergency ward is quiet at 2:14 a.m. Fluorescent lights hum over empty gurneys. A nurse named Elena Cruz checks a monitor, her hands steady, her face unreadable. She has worked this floor for 3 years. Nobody asks about the years before that. The doors bang open. Not paramedics. For men in stolen scrubs, faces covered, rifles low against their legs. One fires a single round into the ceiling. Tile dust falls like snow. Nobody moves. Nobody calls anyone. Patients freeze. A resident drops a chart. Elena does not flinch. She does not raise her hands like the others. She simply watches the men's feet, their grips, the way they clear the room. And something in her stillness is wrong. Too calm. Too measured. She lowers her eyes before anyone notices. They think she is just a nurse. They are about to learn how wrong that is. The emergency ward at St. Augustine Medical Center never fully slept, but at 11 p.m. it exhaled. The waiting room thinned to a handful of tired faces. Machines beeped in steady, unhurried rhythm. Elena Cruz moved through it the way she moved through every shift. Quiet, economical, unnoticed. She was 34, average height, hair pulled back in a plain clip. Nothing about her invited a second look. That was, in its own way, the point at the nurse's station. She reviewed charts with the same flat attention she gave everything. Bed 4, appendicitis, stable. Bed 7, elderly fall, mild concussion, needs monitoring. Bed 9, he's getting agitated again, said Marcus, one of the younger residents, nodding toward bed 9. A man in his 20s, still riding the tail end of a bad reaction to something he wouldn't name, thrashed weakly against the rail. I've got it, Elena said. She didn't rush. She approached at an angle, not head-on, staying outside his direct line of sight until the last moment. A detail no textbook mentioned and no one on this floor would have recognized as deliberate. Her voice, when she spoke, dropped half an octave, flattened into something almost monotone. You're at St. Augustine. You're safe. I need you to breathe with me. She counted with him. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. His shoulders dropped on the 3rd cycle. By the 5th, his grip on the rail loosened. How'd you do that so fast? Marcus asked afterward, half joking. You're like ice back there. Practice, she said, and left it there. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth he imagined. Later, restocking a supply cart near the ambulance bay doors, she paused. Not long, just a half-second longer than restocking required, and let her eyes move across the room. 2 exits besides the main doors. 1 fire stairwell, propped open against regulation, which she made a mental note to report and didn't. A security camera in the far corner, angled wrong, blind to the tree-off desk. She'd noticed it 3 shifts ago. She noticed it again now, filed it, moved on. This was not vigilance born of anxiety. It was older than that, worn smooth by repetition, the kind of scanning that no longer felt like effort. It simply happened, the way breathing happened. Near 1 a.m., a nurse named Priya dropped into the chair beside her during a lull, exhaling. I don't know how you stay so calm in here. Last week with that guy swinging the 4-pole, I was ready to call security and hide in the supply closet. You just walked up like it was nothing. Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile, the kind meant to close a conversation gently rather than open one. Someone has to. Priya laughed and let it go, the way people always let it go. Elena Cruz was simply steady, reliable, the nurse you wanted on a bad night, not because she was extraordinary, but because she was dependable. That was the story the ward told itself about her, and she had spent 3 years making sure it was the only story anyone had reason to tell. At 1:47 a.m., the ambulance bay doors buzzed. Routine transport, the board said. Elena glanced up out of habit, clocked the unfamiliar vehicle idling outside a beat longer than an ambulance should idle, and looked back down at her chart. Probably nothing. She kept working. But some old, quiet part of her, the part no one on this floor had ever met, did not stop watching the doors. The gunshot patient came in at 12:38 a.m., 22 minutes before Elena noticed the idling car. He arrived by private vehicle, not ambulance. A detail the intake clerk flagged, and then let slide, because the wound was real and the man was pale and sweating and needed attention now. Paperwork later. 2 friends carried him in. Said he'd been cleaning a hunting rifle. It had misfired. Simple accident. Elena helped get him onto a gurney and began cutting away his jacket sleeve to expose the wound. Through and through, upper shoulder, clean entry, clean exit. She'd seen 100 wounds in her life that didn't match their stories, and this one didn't match his. The angle was wrong for a cleaning accident. The entry point suggested the shot had come from roughly waist height, fired upward. A struggle, not a mishap. She said nothing. She logged the wound dimensions, dressed it, and moved on, because that was not her job tonight. Noticing things that weren't her job to notice was a habit from a different life, one she kept folded small and out of sight. Friends was also the wrong word for the two men who'd carried him in. They didn't ask about his condition. They didn't ask when he could go home. One stood by the doors the entire time, arms crossed, watching hallway traffic instead of watching his injured friend. The other checked his phone every 90 seconds, a rhythm too even to be nerves. She cataloged their faces without seeming to look at them. Not out of suspicion exactly. More out of a discipline so old it no longer required a reason. At-115, the hallway camera near triage flickered, blacked out for 4 seconds, and came back. Marcus noticed it too, said something about the building's ancient wiring, and forgot it inside a minute. Elena didn't forget it. She filed it beside the badly angled camera she'd noticed weeks ago, beside the propped fire door, beside the man at bed 9, beside the wound that didn't match its story. None of it, alone, meant anything. Together, it formed a shape she recognized, faint but familiar, like a word almost remembered. T-147. The ambulance bay doors buzzed for a transport that wasn't on the schedule. Elena looked up. A dark SUV sat at the curb, engine running, no medical markings, no driver visible getting out to assist. It idled a beat too long, the particular stillness of a vehicle waiting for something other than a patient. She looked back down at her chart. Her pen didn't stop moving. But somewhere beneath the surface calm, a switch she hadn't used in 3 years shifted quietly into place. She told herself, one more time, that it was probably nothing. She did not believe it, and some part of her, the part that used to belong to rooms far more dangerous than this one, had already begun, without asking her permission, to prepare. At a T-152, she walked to the supply closet nearest the ambulance bay, retrieved gauze she didn't yet need, and used the 90 extra seconds to recheck. The exits, 2 out besides the main doors, the prop stairwell, the blind camera. She returned to the desk before anyone noticed she'd been gone longer than restocking required. Bed 9's patient had settled. The gunshot patient slept, monitored, guarded by men who weren't his friends. The ward hummed along in its ordinary rhythm, unaware that the only person in the building who understood what was coming had already, quietly, begun to count. At T-214, the doors banged open. The sound came first, not gunfire, but the doors themselves, thrown wide with enough force to crack one hinge. For men entered in stolen scrubs, masks pulled over the lower half of their faces, rifles held low and ready in a way no hospital orderly ever carried anything. One of them fired a single round into the ceiling. Plastered dust drifted down through the fluorescent light like slow snow. The sound swallowed every other sound in the room. A monitor's beep, a whispered conversation, the hum of the vending machine down the hall, until there was only silence and the ringing after the shot. Nobody moves. Nobody calls anyone. Phone's on the floor. Now, Marcus dropped his clipboard. A patient's family member in the waiting area let out a short, strangled sound, and then went quiet, hand over her own mouth. Priya froze mid-step, halfway between 2 beds, her body caught in the particular helplessness of someone who has never had to imagine this moment before it arrived. Elena did not freeze. She also did not move. She lowered herself the way the others did, hands rising, shoulders dropping, eyes wide with the correct amount of fear, but underneath the performance, her mind had already gone still and clear in a way she hadn't allowed it to go in 3 years. She counted the men. For visible. The one who'd fired the ceiling shot held himself like the one giving orders, though he wasn't barking loudest. The quiet ones usually ran things. 2 others fanned out to cover the room's exits, rifles low, movements drilled rather than instinctive. Former military, she guessed, or trained by someone who had been. The 4th stayed close to the ambulance bay doors, watching the hallway they'd come from, guarding their own way out. She noted the weapons, carbines, not hunting rifles, magazines that looked full, safeties that looked disengaged already, which told her they expected to use them. She noted that none of the four seemed surprised the gunshot patient was already inside. This had been planned around him. Phones, the quiet one repeated, and this time people obeyed fast, sliding them across the floor in a small scattering of glass and plastic. Elena added hers to the pile. Old habit made her palm brush the floor a half-second longer than necessary, feeling for the room's layout through her fingertips the way she used to feel for tripwires and doorframes that no longer existed for her. Except in memory and in the body's refusal to forget, the men herded staff and patients toward the center of the main bay, clustering nearly 30 people into a space meant for a fraction that number. Elena moved when told, sat when told, kept her eyes down when it mattered and up just enough when it didn't. Enough to keep counting .4 hostiles. 2 entry points now sealed. 1 propped stairwell door likely still unwatched because they hadn't found it yet. 1 blind camera that meant whatever backup was coming would arrive without a clear picture of what waited inside. A woman near her, mother of the concussion patient in bed 7, began to cry softly. Elena reached over without drawing attention and put a steady hand on her arm, the gesture of any nurse comforting any frightened stranger. It was also, quietly, something else. Contact low enough to avoid notice, close enough to protect, positioning herself half a step in front of the woman and the child beside her, without anyone realizing the shift had happened. The quiet leader moved toward the gunshot patient's bed, checked on him with something almost like tenderness, murmured a few words Elena couldn't fully hear. Then he turned and surveyed the room. 30 hostages, for guns, 1 hospital, and somewhere outside, sirens already beginning to gather in the distance. Faint and far away, he didn't look afraid. He looked satisfied. Elena kept her head down, her hands folded, her breathing slow and even. Marcus, beside her, was pale and shaking. Priya had gone rigid with silent tears. The room believed, entirely, that it was surrounded by frightened staff and helpless patients. Only Elena understood that the room now contained a variable none of the 4 men had accounted for. She did not know yet exactly what she would do. She only knew, with the flat certainty of long training, that she would not simply wait to be rescued. Somewhere behind her calm face, the old switch that had shifted into place 20 minutes earlier settled fully, silently, into work. 20 minutes into the siege, the man in bed 9, the gunshot patient, began to fade. His blood pressure had been unstable since intake, and the stress of the takeover was accelerating something Elena had already flagged as a slow internal bleed. His monitor, still connected, chirped a low warning that the leader either didn't hear or didn't understand. Elena did. She raised her hand slowly, the way a nurse raises a hand when she needs something, not the way a hostage raises a hand when she wants attention. That man needs a doctor. His pressure's dropping. If nobody treats him, he's going to die in front of you, and that's not what you want him for. The room went still in a different way now. The stillness of people watching someone speak to armed men as though the situation were still, somehow, medical. The leader crossed the room, studied her for a long moment through his mask. You touch him, you do exactly what I say. Nothing else. That's how I always work. Elena said. It was, in fact, exactly how she always worked, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. As she approached the bed with Marcus's borrowed stethoscope and her own flat calm, and began the kind of exam that looked, to everyone watching, like ordinary tria. Blood pressure cuff. Pulse at the wrist. A light pressed briefly to each eye. But her hands were doing 2 jobs at once. While she worked the cuff, her eyes moved once, precisely, across the man's exposed forearm. A tattoo, half covered by a bandage, a unit insignia she recognized from a different life. One that told her more about who these men were and why they wanted this patient stable than any file ever could. While she checked his pulse, she let her gaze drift, just once, toward the leader's belt line, cataloging the sidearm holstered there, the extra magazine, the small radio clipped near his collar. Command and control. Someone outside was talking to him, or would be soon. He's lost more blood than they're telling you, she said quietly, to no one and everyone. He needs fluids, or you'll lose your reason for being here. The leader's jaw tightened beneath the mask. Do it. She started in 4 with hands that did not shake, murmuring the same low, practiced words she'd used on the man last week thrashing against his rail. the voice that lowered heart rates, that made panicking men still. It worked on the patient. It worked, faintly, even on the leader, whose shoulders eased by some small fraction as he watched her competence do what his own men's guns could not: buy him time without violence. "You're good at this," he said, almost to himself. "I've had a lot of practice," Elena said, and did not elaborate, and he did not ask, because men in his position rarely wondered about the inner lives of nurses. That, she understood clearly now, was the exact shape of her advantage. She finished the 4, checked the drip rate, and stepped back with her hands folded, playing the frightened professional even as her mind filed away everything she'd learned. For hostiles, one radio line to an outside contact, a tattoo suggesting these men had trained together in a unit she half recognized, a leader capable of a flicker of gratitude, which meant he was capable, somewhere beneath the mask, of being reasoned with or exploited. Across the room, Priya watched her with something between awe and confusion, unable to name what she'd just seen, only certain that Elena had somehow made an armed man's shoulders relax without saying a single unnecessary word. Elena returned to her place on the floor beside the frightened mother from bed 7, sat, folded her hands, and lowered her eyes. Beneath the folded hands, one finger moved once against her own wrist, an old, private habit, counting seconds, marking time the way she used to before every quiet, careful thing she had ever done that mattered. Outside, past the sealed doors, the sirens had multiplied. Somewhere among them, though she had no way to know it yet, people who had once known her by a very different name were beginning to arrive. By the top of the hour, Elena had stopped thinking of the room as a hostage situation and started thinking of it the way she used to think of rooms like this, as a problem with a shape that could be changed one small adjustment at a time, so long as no one noticed the adjustments were happening at all. She began with the people. Under the guise of checking on patients, a nurse doing what nurses do even under a gun, which none of the 4 men seemed inclined to stop. She moved slowly through the huddled group, repositioning without appearing to reposition. The mother and child from bed 7, she guided half a step behind a support pillar. An elderly man with a walker, she settled nearer the wall, out of any likely line of fire. Marcus and Priya, still pale, she kept close to herself, near the room's only structural cover, without ever suggesting she was doing anything but comforting them. "Stay near me," she murmured to Priya, adjusting a blanket around the shivering mother beside her. "Just breathe. Don't watch them. Watch me." It cost her nothing to say, and it did exactly what it needed to do. It gave 3 frightened people an anchor, and it gave Elena 3 fewer variables to track when the moment came that she would need to move fast. She watched the guard's rotation next. The one nearest the ambulance doors changed position every 4 minutes, pacing a short line, checking the hallway, returning. The 2 covering the room's exits stood mostly still, but their attention dipped, predictably, whenever the leader spoke. A small tell, a half-second window where the room's guns were. For a moment, listening instead of watching. She logged it the way she used to log a patrol's blind spot, without emotion, simply as fact to be used later. Near 2:50 a.m., the leader crossed to check on the gunshot patient again, and this time he carried something new in his hand, a folding knife, opened, meant to cut away the dressing Elena had applied so he could inspect the wound himself. "Let me," Elena said, already moving before he could refuse. Because a man with an open blade near an unstable 4-line was a hazard she could not simply watch unfold. "You'll tear the line if you're not careful." "I'll do it," he hesitated, then handed the knife over hilt first, an act of trust so small he likely didn't register it as trust at all, merely convenience, merely her competence doing his job for him. Elena took the knife. For half a second, something old and exact moved through her hands, a stillness that was not hesitation but its opposite, a body remembering, without being told to remember, exactly how a blade like this could be turned, closed, folded flat against a palm, and made to disappear. From a stranger's notice entirely. She did none of that. She cut the dressing cleanly, efficiently, the way any competent nurse would, and folded the knife closed before handing it back grip first. Blade never once turned toward him. Gesture unremarkable, ordinary, forgettable, but she had held it. She had felt its balance, its edge, its weight, and some quiet calculation in the back of her mind. The same part of her that had once assessed rooms for a living filed the knife away as a known variable now, one more piece on a board only she could see. "Good as new," she said, and stepped back. The leader looked at her a beat longer than necessary, something unreadable behind the mask, before turning away. Priya, watching from the floor, caught Elena's eye and mouthed, silently, "How are you not scared?" Elena only shook her head slightly. Not a denial, not quite a reassurance, and returned to her place beside the mother and child, hands folded, breathing even. The room reorganized so subtly around her that not one of the four armed men understood they were no longer standing in the position of total control they believed they held. Outside, unseen, the first tactical response vehicle slid quietly into position 2 streets away, awaiting a picture of the inside that no one yet had. Inside, Elena Cruz sat on the floor of an emergency ward, folded her hands, and kept building one. The first mistake belonged to the leader. The second belonged to fear, which rarely waits for a good moment to arrive. Near 3:15 a.m., one of the 2 men guarding the room's exits began watching Elena instead of the hostages. He was younger than the others, his rifle held a fraction too tight, his weight shifting more than the leader's ever did. He had noticed, in the slow accumulating way suspicion works, that the nurse never flinched, not at the ceiling shot, not at the knife, not at anything. "You," he said, stepping toward her. "Why aren't you scared like the rest of them?" The room's attention shifted with him. Elena kept her eyes down a half-second longer than instinct wanted, then lifted them slowly, deliberately soft. "I've watched people die in this building for 3 years, she said, voice thin, careful to sound tired rather than steady. "I ran out of scared a long time ago. It was a true sentence built to hide a truer one." He studied her, rifle still raised, and something in her exhaustion, real exhaustion, the kind 3 years of night shifts actually gave a person, seemed to satisfy him more than any performance could have. He stepped back, though his eyes stayed on her a beat longer than she liked. She had wanted, badly, for that to be the end of it. It wasn't 0.4 minutes later, the elderly man near the wall. The one with the walker, the one she'd carefully repositioned out of the likely line of fire, began to seize. It happened without warning, his body jerking, his walker clattering sideways. And the sudden violent motion in a room full of taut nerves and loaded rifles did what sudden motion always does in rooms like that. The suspicious guard spun toward the sound, rifle rising, shouting for stillness that the seizing man's body could not obey. Elena moved before she decided to move, closing the distance in 3 steps, dropping to her knees beside him, physically placing her own body at an angle between the old man and the guard's rifle. Not dramatically, not as a shield exactly, simply as a nurse kneeling to help a patient, which was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. Her hands worked fast, turning him onto his side, clearing space around his head, counting seconds under her breath in a voice pitched to carry calm rather than panic. "He's seizing, not attacking. Everybody stay still. I need 30 seconds. The guard's rifle stayed raised, his breathing ragged, his young hands shaking in a way that frightened Elena more than the weapon itself. An untrained man with a loaded gun and adrenaline was its own kind of unpredictable danger. She kept her voice low, even, aimed as much at him as at the room. 30 seconds. That's all. Look at me. Not him. It was, in its structure, the exact same technique she'd used on the man in bed 9 days earlier, and on the panicking patient the week before that. Voice as a tool. Calm as something that could be transmitted like a current from one body to another. The guard's rifle lowered, fractionally, as the seizure passed, and the old man's body stilled into the loose, spent quiet that follows. The leader arrived a moment later, taking in the scene. Nurse kneeling over patient, young guard breathing hard, room frozen and held breath, and made a decision that told Elena something important about him. "Let her work," he said. "Nobody touches the patients unless I say so." It was, in its way, an order that protected her further, expanding whatever quiet authority she'd built into something the others now had to respect. But it also meant he had begun watching her more closely, turning his attention toward the one person in the room who had, twice now, controlled a dangerous moment better than his own trained men. Elena settled the old man into recovery position, checked his pulse, murmured reassurance to his terrified family a few feet away, and did not allow her face to show what she now understood clearly. The leader was no longer merely tolerating her competence. He was beginning to study it. Outside, unseen by anyone in the room, an FBI tactical van eased into a stairwell approached 2 floors below. Guided by a partial layout, an informant inside the building's security office had finally managed to transmit a layout that did not, and could not, account for the one asset already inside, kneeling on a hospital floor, buying time in a language only she fully understood. At 3:40 a.m., a voice crackled through the leader's radio, thin and distorted, but audible enough that half the room heard it too. They want proof of life, and proof you're serious. The leader looked toward the crowd of hostages for a long moment, and Elena understood, with the flat certainty of long experience, what proof you're serious meant in negotiations like this. It meant someone was about to be hurt to make a point to the people outside. He chose the elderly man's daughter, the same young mother from bed 7, still holding her sleeping child, still trembling from 20 minutes of watching her father seize on the floor. The leader crossed the room and took her arm, pulling her up and away from the child, toward the center of the space where the outside cameras, if any existed inside, might catch a clean line of sight. "No," the woman said, voice breaking. "Please, my son, you'll be fine if everyone stays calm." The leader said, though his tone carried none of the certainty of the words. Elena stood. She had spent the last 90 minutes building a careful architecture of invisibility, competence disguised as ordinary nursing, calm disguised as exhaustion, awareness disguised as habit. Standing now, stepping between the leader and the woman, meant risking all of it. It meant, potentially, the end of the only advantage she had. She did it anyway. "Take me instead," she said. "She has a child. I don't. If you need someone to show them you're serious, use someone the room can't grieve into chaos. Use me." The room went silent in a way it hadn't gone silent even for the ceiling shot. Priya's hand rose halfway to her mouth. Marcus stared at Elena as though seeing her for the first time, though he could not yet say why. The leader studied her, mask hiding whatever calculation moved behind his eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's my job," Elena said, and let the words carry the exact amount of simple, exhausted truth a night shift nurse would mean by them, while beneath the sentence, unseen, sat a truer and older reason she did not say aloud, that she had sworn, a long time ago, in a different uniform, to be the one who stepped into that gap when no one else could. The leader released the mother's arm that he gripped Elena's instead, pulling her toward the center of the room, and in that motion, in the brief half-second where his hand closed around her wrist, Elena felt the shape of his grip, its strength, its habits, the way his thumb pressed rather than gripped. Information she filed away, even as her outward face showed nothing but a nurse's frightened compliance. He raised his pistol, not toward her, but into the air near her head, a gesture meant to be seen and heard beyond the ward's walls. A warning shot dressed as a threat. It did not fire. Instead, in the half-second before he could decide, Elena's free hand moved, not to strike, not to disarm, but simply to grip his forearm and press, hard, into a nerve point at the wrist that made his fingers open on reflex before conscious thought could stop them. The pistol clattered to the tile. The it happened fast enough that half the room saw only a nurse falling against a gunman in fear. It happened precisely enough that Elena had already stepped back, hands raised, playing terrified, before the other 3 men's rifles swung toward her. "She startled me," the leader said, quickly, oddly, retrieving his own weapon from the floor himself rather than admit what his hand had actually done. Something in his voice suggested he did not fully understand yet what had just happened to his own grip, only that it had happened, and that the woman in front of him was not what she appeared to be. That he did not shoot her. He did not test her again. He only watched her now with the wary, searching look of a man who has, for the first time, felt something he cannot name move against him in a room he believed he controlled completely. Elena returned to her place beside the mother and child, her wrist throbbing where his grip had been, a thin bracelet of bruise already beginning to rise beneath her sleeve. She had paid for the moment with exposure she could not fully take back. The leader's eyes did not leave her now, not fully, not ever again for the rest of the night. But the mother sat holding her son, unharmed, and the room, for now, remained a hostage situation rather than the beginning of an execution. Elena closed her eyes briefly, breathed once, and opened them again clear. The cost had been paid. The count had not yet finished rising. At 4:05 a.m., the radio at the leader's collar crackled again, this time carrying a voice tighter with urgency than before. They're not moving on our demands. We need a second show, bigger. And in the standoff before shift change brings more staff into the building. Elena, seated near the wall, heard enough of it to understand the timeline had just collapsed. Whatever patience the leader had been operating with was gone. She looked, without turning her head, toward the propped stairwell door across the room. The one detail from the very start of the night that none of the four men had yet discovered. Because it sat behind a supply alcove none of them had bothered to search. She looked, too, at the blind security camera in the corner. The one that meant anyone outside coordinating a breach still had no clear picture of where the four hostiles stood inside the room. She had, over the last 2 hours, quietly become the only accurate map of this space that existed anywhere. The leader crossed to the center of the room again, pistol raised, voice hard now in a way it hadn't been before. Everyone up. Line against the wall. Now. Compliance rippled through the hostages, 30 frightened people rising unevenly, the room's careful order breaking apart into exactly the kind of chaotic movement that made control difficult and violence more likely. Elena rose with them, positioning herself, without seeming to choose it, near the mother and child, near Marcus and Priya, near the edge closest to the propped stairwell door. The young guard, the one who'd questioned her hours earlier, moved to close the gap between the hostages and the wall, rifle raised, shouting for faster movement. His attention, for 1/2 second, split between the crowd and the leader awaiting his signal at the center of the room. Elena had been waiting 2 hours for exactly that half second. She did not run. She did not shout. She stepped, once, sideways, closing the distance to the young guard's flank, and used the same nerve point control she'd used on the leader's wrist, precise, economical, unglamorous, to drive his rifle's barrel downward and offline before he could register that the nurse beside him had moved at all. The weapon discharged into the floor, the sound swallowing the room's breath for the second time that night, and in the half-second of stunned stillness that followed, Elena stripped the rifle from his slackened grip and put him on the ground with a single controlled motion that looked, to anyone watching, like a lucky, desperate grab rather than what it actually was. A technique trained into her body across years she had spent, until tonight, pretending she had never lived. Down, she said to the hostages, voice suddenly carrying an authority none of them had heard from her before. Everybody down, now. They obeyed instantly, some instinct in the command itself cutting through fear faster than any explanation could have. The second guard turned toward the sound, rifle rising, and Elena was already moving, low, fast, using an overturned gurney as cover exactly the way cover was meant to be used, closing the distance before he could bring his weapon fully to bear. She did not shoot him. She had no gun yet, only the rifle in her own hands, safety still engaged, deliberately. She used it instead as leverage, driving the stock into his weapon arm hard enough to break his grip, following with a strike that put him down without a single round fired. 2 hostiles down. 2 remained, the one guarding the ambulance doors, and the leader himself, both now turning toward a threat they could not immediately identify, because the room's chaos and their own men's sudden collapse had, for a critical 2 seconds, made Elena Cruz invisible in plain sight. The leader found her first, pistol swinging toward her across the room, and in that instant Elena did the one thing that had defined every choice she'd made all night. She did not seek a clean shot of her own. She threw herself sideways behind the same overturned gurney, shielding the mother and child still crouched near it, and shouted the words that mattered more than any weapon in her hands. FBI, drop it. This ends now. Nobody else has to get hurt tonight. The words landed strangely in the room. A nurse's voice, but not a nurse's authority, something in its exact, level calm that made even the leader hesitate for the half-second Elena needed. Behind him, the stairwell door, the one propped open since before the siege began, the one no one had thought to check, burst inward, and the first tactical unit through it found a scene that made no sense to them for exactly as long as it took to understand it. 2 hostiles down, unconscious, disarmed. A nurse in blood-flecked scrubs crouched behind a gurney with a stripped rifle in her hands, shielding two civilians, and a leader, pistol still raised, suddenly caught between a threat from behind and one from in front that he had, until 30 seconds ago, believed was simply hospital staff. He did not fire. In the half-second that followed, Elena's earlier restraint, every choice she had made not to escalate, not to expose more than necessary, not to take a life when a life could be avoided, meant the leader chose, in the end, to lower the weapon rather than die in a room full of people he had never intended to kill, only to it was over in under 90 seconds. It felt, to everyone who lived through it, like much longer. Elena stayed low behind the gurney until the tactical team confirmed the room clear, her hand still pressed flat against the mother's shoulder, steady. The same calm voice she'd used all night, murmuring the same 4 words she'd used since 11 p.m. "You're safe now. Breathe." Only when the last hostile was in restraints did she finally let herself sit back against the gurney, exhausted in a way that had nothing left to hide behind, her wrist throbbing, a shallow graze along her forearm she hadn't noticed until now. And for the first time in 3 years, no reason left to pretend she was only what the room believed her to be. The ward filled with tactical personnel within minutes, moving through the space with the brisk, practiced efficiency of people restoring order to a room that had briefly belonged to someone else. Paramedics who were not part of the siege at all began treating the genuinely wounded. The 2 guards Elena had put down, the leader now zip-tied and silent, the ordinary patients whose night had turned into something none of them would fully process for weeks. Elena sat against the gurney where the tactical team had found her and did not get up right away. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders out of habit, the way blankets are draped over anyone who has survived something, and she let them, because refusing would have drawn more attention than accepting. It didn't matter. The attention found her anyway. A man in a plain jacket, no visible weapon, moved through the wreckage of restored order with the unhurried authority of someone who outranked everyone currently shouting instructions. He crouched in front of Elena, studied her face for a long moment, and said a name that had not been spoken aloud in this building in 3 years. Cruz. Not ma'am. Not nurse. A name, flat and certain, spoken the way you speak to someone you already know, not someone you're meeting. Elena looked up at him, and something in her exhausted face shifted. Not surprise exactly, more the quiet, resigned recognition of a debt finally called in. "Agent Whitfield," she said. "It's been a while. 3 years." He glanced around the wrecked, blood-flecked ward, at the restrained leader, at the 2 guards being loaded onto stretchers under guard, at the 30 hostages beginning to understand, in scattered whispers, that the quiet nurse who'd knelt over the seizing man 3 hours ago had also, somehow, ended this. "Command's going to want a full statement. Tonight, if you're able." "I'm able," Elena said. "Give me the room first." He nodded once and stood, giving her exactly that. A few more minutes before the machinery of debriefing swallowed the night whole. Priya found her a moment later, sitting on an overturned supply cart nearby, staring at Elena with an expression caught between fear and something closer to grief for a version of her friend that had apparently never fully existed. "Cruz," she said, testing the word the way Whitfield had said it. You're not just a nurse." "I am a nurse," Elena said, and meant it, because 3 years of night shifts had made that true in a way that didn't erase what came before it. "I used to do other work. A long time before this." Tonight didn't feel like a long time before, Marcus said quietly, still pale, still holding his own elbow the way people hold themselves together after shock. Elena didn't answer that, because there was no answer that would make the last 3 hours easier to carry, and she had learned, a long time ago, that trying to explain competence to people who hadn't needed it before rarely helped either of them. The hospital administrator arrived within the hour, along with a small cluster of hospital security who had failed, comprehensively, to prevent any of it, and a local news van that had somehow already found the story despite the scene barely being secured. A reporter, seeing the small crowd gathering around the nurse who'd apparently disarmed 2 gunmen, began moving toward Elena with a microphone raised. She stood before the reporter reached her, blanket still around her shoulders, and found Whitfield with her eyes. "Keep them off me," she said quietly. "I don't need the story." I need this room to go back to being a hospital. He nodded. And within a minute a line of agents had formed a quiet, unremarkable barrier between the press and the ambulance bay, the kind of barrier that photographs badly and asks nothing of anyone's attention. Elena gave her statement in a supply room repurposed as an interview space, flat and precise, detailing threat counts and weapon types and timeline with the same economy she'd once used in briefings that no longer technically existed. When it was done, near dawn, she changed out of her blood-flecked scrubs into a spare set from her locker, washed her face in the staff bathroom mirror, and looked, for a long moment, at the small bruised bracelet still forming around her wrist. She did not look at herself the way a person looks at a hero. She looked at herself the way a person looks at a debt paid, quietly, without applause, and mostly without witnesses who would ever fully understand what the payment had cost. By the time the sun rose over the ambulance bay, the SUVs were gone. The press had nothing but a blocked shot of hospital doors, and the ward's day shift arrived to find overturned gurneys, evidence tape, and a strange, hushed quiet among the night staff that no one fully explained to them. Elena Cruz clocked out at 7:02 a.m., 3 minutes late, the way she almost always did. 3 weeks later, the ward had mostly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The cracked hinge on the ambulance bay door had been replaced. The blind camera in the corner had finally been repaired, a full year after Elena first noticed it, for reasons the hospital administration never fully explained to the staff beyond a vague memo about security upgrades. Elena worked the night shift, same as always. Her name did not appear in any published account of what the local news eventually called, briefly and without much detail, a resolved hostage incident. Whitfield's office had handled that part quietly, the way such things were always handled, a story flattened into vagueness, a nurse's name kept out of it entirely, a debt to her old life settled in exchange for a debt to this new one being repaid in full and then quietly closed. She had been offered, in the weeks since, a reassignment, a desk, a training post. Whitfield had said the words carefully, respectfully, the way you offer someone a door back into a life they'd chosen to leave once already. Elena had listened, thanked him, and declined. I like this work, she told him, and it was, in its plain way, entirely true. Tonight, a new nurse named Diane sat beside her at the station during a lull, 23 years old, 3 weeks into her first real job, still young enough to ask the questions everyone else on the floor had long since learned not to ask. Is it true? Diane said, glancing sideways, voice low. What happened here? Some of the paramedics talk about it like you did something. Like you weren't just working the desk that night. Elena finished charting a note, capped her pen, and considered the question the way she considered most things now, carefully, without more weight than it needed. I used to work in government logistics, she said. A long time before this job. That's it. Logistics. That's it. Elena said, and something in her tone closed the conversation gently, the same way it had closed 100 conversations before it. Not unkindly, simply finally. Diane looked like she wanted to ask more, glanced at the small, faded bruise marks still faintly visible on Elena's wrist in the right light, and then let it go, the way people always eventually let it go around her. A call light blinked at bed 6. Elena rose without hurry, smoothed her scrubs, and walked the same unhurried, economical walk she always had. The walk of a woman 34 years old, average height. Nothing about her inviting a second look. She checked on the patient in bed 6, adjusted in 4-line with steady hands, spoke in the low, even voice that lowered heart rates and stilled panicking men, and moved on to the next bed and the one after that, through a night that would, in all likelihood, remain ordinary until its very end spotlight found her. No parade waited outside. The only recognition she had accepted was a quiet handshake from Whitfield in a hospital corridor 3 weeks ago, and even that, she had asked him to keep brief. Some debts, she had learned long ago, were paid best in silence. At 3 a.m., the ward hummed along in its familiar rhythm, machines beeping steady, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a hospital doing what hospitals do at the quietest hour of the night. Elena Cruz moved through it exactly as she always had, unremarkable, dependable, watched by no one who understood what watching her closely might have revealed. That, in the end, was precisely how she preferred it.